Okay, hello everyone. Good morning. We are coming to you all the way from Cameroon. This is Sandrine and Melvis, and we'll be presenting to you on the topic using critical thinking activities to enhance speaking skills. Now, it's just a moment for us to share our professional experience in this area of critical thinking. So this whole initiative came from an observation with our learners with some lapses that they have, like especially difficulties expressing themselves orally. So you notice that when you take maybe other courses, learners could do better, but that was not the case when we got to speaking lessons. So what we did was to go through did some research and came up with some activities that we went into the classroom and tried them out and came up with some findings. So our session is going to run like this. We'll begin by talking about our learners, that's our teaching context. We'll present the critical thinking activities that we actually brought into the classroom. In the third place, we'll have our lesson proper. Excuse me. That's what actually happened in the class. And finally, our observations, that is the transformations we found in the learners. Okay, excuse me, please. Now, our learners who are there, so we have a typical classroom setting. It's an English-speaking predominant context, but the learners are of French-speaking background and maybe Pidgin English a lot. And their learning system somehow makes them to practice a lot of memorization. They do a lot, they like grammar a lot, but they can recite mostly the roles. For instance, they can go on and on about I have, you have, he has, but they are never able to maybe pick up a productive skill, like take part in a dialogue of their own. So whenever you're teaching, we discover the lessons got stuck. Or even when they meet you in the hallway after a class, they may know the word good morning, but they won't be able to use that to say good morning. So that was a challenge we had with our learners. And so we went searching for answers to our difficulties. We came across these activities that became so relevant in prompting speaking in our learners. In the first place, we looked at describing visuals. So it's not something challenging. I think it's something we do every day. Like you just have to chest an image, ask questions related to that image, and learners talk about it. So instead of them memorizing, it got them speaking from their own perspective. And then there was this why because game. We picked up from Claire Lavery, Fluency Activities for Lower Levels, actually on the British Council Facebook page. So with this, the why because game, we actually, the learners come up with statements about a particular event or an area of interest, and a partner asks the learner, why are you saying so? For instance, I like frogs. Why do you say so? Because the person goes on to give those justification. So there you are not pumping knowledge into the learners, you make them to think and say things. And then we had the witness game. Now this is done in two groups. We have the group A, who are the witness. You have the group B, who are the police officer. And now you have to show a picture of 2, 3, 4, 5 pictures to the witness. The witness looks at the picture without the police officer seeing. Now, after they briefly look at that image, those of group B, now the police officer have to kind of investigate. So they ask them what they saw in the image, And those in group A, they describe what they saw. And at the end, those in group B have to pick the correct picture that has been described. So that's for the witness game. Then with the stem sentences, it's all about grouping stems of sentences in a particular area. For instance, it could be holidays or say routine activities. Could be asking the learners, what do you do on Sundays? So you just give them on Sundays, and the learners have to complete. So they have to think of what to say in order to complete that. On Tuesdays, in the mornings, So that's how STEM sentences actually work. And then we have stories. We got that inspiration from the Thinking Train series by Herbert Kucher, where you present a story and there are some critical thinking activities following the story. They could be asked to predict, they could be asked to pass a judgment and all of that. So instead of just memorizing, learners have to use their own minds to verbalize what they are thinking. And we also looked at, still in line with stories, we brought in this Graham Stanley's use of oral
Our lesson is drawn from the Cameroon syllabus, which is divided into 5 modules. We focused on module 1, which is the most important. Hello.
Recording in progress.
Our lesson is drawn from the Cameroon syllabus, which is divided into 5 modules. So we took our lesson from module 1, which is the most fundamental in the lives of our learners, because it deals with the immediate environment of our learners. The situation here was participating in cultural and traditional manifestations, and our class was a Quatrième class, which is third year in junior secondary. The average age of our learners was 13, and their language level is A2, meaning they can communicate using basic vocabulary and basic language structures. In our next slide, our next slide gives details about the lesson title, talking about the Bamileke culture, and the objective of our lesson was to prompt learners to be able to talk about the Bamileke culture and give their opinion as well on the Bamileke cultural dance and other cultural practices. To introduce our lessons, we used a warmer activity which was aimed at putting our learners in a learning disposition. So our warmer was a word tennis activity, which helped us to capture and most importantly, to retain the attention of our learners. For this activity, we set the class into 2 teams and each team picked its name. So I explained the task to the learners and demonstrated with one strong student before the activity proper. For this, I demonstrated with the students on naming fruits, and the 2 other groups in the class, the 2 groups in the class continued. They followed suit, naming cultural events in Cameroon. Each team had just 5 seconds to produce a correct answer, and a word could only be used once. Okay, as seen on the next slide, the first stage of our lesson was the discovery stage, which entailed describing visuals. For this, I anchored the visuals to my chest, and the learners described them one by one. As on the first visual on your screen, you can see a lady with a fiber bag hanging down her right wrist and a horse's tail in the same hand. She has no shoes on. So I continue to stage 2. Okay, as seen on this stage 1, the activity we carried out was describing visuals, and it was the first activity, the first critical thinking activity we used to enable the learners express themselves orally while thinking critically. As seen on the image in front of your screens, we have a lady with a fiber bag in her wrist, in her right wrist. In the second image, as seen on your screens, we have some men with putting on beaded elephant masks. On the third image, on the next image, good. We have a group of men without clothes on, just attired in the traditional fabric. Some carrying pots with burning fire on their heads. Okay, after presenting these visuals, we didn't just end there, but we continued with the why because activity. This one was also one of the activities we used to enhance critical thinking, to enhance oral performance of our students. In this activity, one student was to make a statement. One student made a statement about the visuals, and another student asked them to justify their claim, and they had to do so. For example, student A, a student we are going to keep anonymous, we're going to label here as student A, said the men in the last picture must be in a chief's palace. So a student B asked, why do you think so? And student A replied, because of the form of the entrance and the triangular outline of the rooftops. So the why because activity prompted them to speak and to be able to justify their claims. Now, another activity we used to enhance critical thinking and oral performance in our students was, oral communication in our students was a short story. I narrated the short story. I read out the short story to them. It was about a young girl visiting her maternal relatives for the first time. This girl goes contrary to her grandmother's instructions and opens a partially buried calabash in the kitchen. This was contrary to her grandmother's instructions. She got scared and she fled. She fled from her home. Okay, so the essence of this story was to prompt students in decision making. At the end of the story, they were able to express their opinions, to tell us what if they thought that the girl did well, if they thought that the girl did the right thing, what they would have done in that girl's shoes, in the place of that girl, what they would have done and why they would have taken that particular decision. So this short story was not just for the sake of telling stories, but to prompt our students in decision making. By so doing, they were able to express themselves orally without thinking, without taking any risk, without thinking of the risk involved in oral productions. Okay, in stage 2 of our lesson, we did a ranking activity, which was also one of the activities, very vital activity in the enhancing critical thinking in our students. This activity was divided into 2 phases. We had phase 1, which was individual, and phase 2, which was collective. These individuals, the phase 1, in phase 1, I wrote out this list of adjectives, as you can see on your screen, wrote them out on the board, and the students took them down. As seen on the next slide, the most important thing was to check that the students understood the meaning of all the items on the board, all those adjectives on the board. We checked so that they understood the meaning before asking them to arrange the adjectives in the order of significance. So they had to work with all the adjectives except the first and the last. They had to rank them in order of significance. They had to work with two. Okay, phase 2 of our lesson was the collective phase of the ranking activity. Here, students had to harmonize the list of adjectives that they had come up with, that the arrangement of adjectives, had to harmonize them. Because in phase 1, they did individual work. So phase 2 was collective, and in groups, in their small groups that we created, they had to harmonize, come together with they had to come up with a final version of it. To do that, they had to use, we put out a group of, a number of expressions on the board, useful expressions that they were to use to convince their bench mates or to convince their group mates into adopting their point of view. So we had expressions like I think, I am sure, I believe. So they use these expressions to convince their bench mates on adopting their point of view. So once those expressions were written out on the board, we paired them in groups and they compared their choices, justified their choices, and came up with a harmonized list of adjectives. For that to happen, of course, we had to go around the class and assist the groups, monitor and make sure that everybody was participating in the activities and assist where help was solicited. All right, at the end of this activity, just a few groups we had envisaged more time and all the groups were able to present their activities. The third stage of our lesson was institutionalization. At this stage, we had the witness game. This was a very interesting hands-on activity that saw the engagement of all the students in the learning process. For this activity, we had 4 pairs of students. For each pair, we had a student A and a student B. So student A of each pair was the witness and student B was a police officer. These students, the essence of this game was to prompt the learners to be able to speak, to be able to describe visuals, to describe what they had seen, and identify the pictures too. Because one person was to describe the pictures, the visuals, and another person in the same pair was to identify which picture had been described. So it was mostly a verbal activity, oral, where we had to prompt oral communication between the students in the different pairs. As seen on the following slide, the first picture we had men here, still in cultural attire, very, very important for our lesson. In the following slide, we have masquerades. Yes, we have masquerades dancing at a traditional festival, probably a funeral. The next slide, we have a man dancing in an elephant mask. And then the last image, we still have a group of dancers. If you are keen enough, you would notice that our pictures have a traditional color attached to it. They have a traditional manifestation attached to it. All these are very important in the lives of our learners. Okay, so after presenting these pictures to our learners, student B, who was the student B of each group, was to describe what they had seen to student A. Student B, who is the police officer, had the opportunity to ask as many questions as they could or as they wanted to ask the questions, to pose the questions to student A so that they can easily identify the pictures which we presented to them. Because after giving out all that information, I gave the students, all the police officers, so the student A's, I gave them a lineup of all the 4 images, and they were to say which one of them the witness had described. Next slide, please. The last phase of our lesson was the evaluation phase, which consisted in giving the learners STEM sentences. So the task was very simple. In duos or trios, the learners were to give their opinion on the Bamileke cultural dance to their partners. Now we try to make just very tiny groups because when the groups are tiny, it encourages everybody to speak. So this evaluation was to evaluate their oral competencies, their oral expressions, oral abilities, to prompt them to speak as much as possible and as naturally as possible without fear of making mistakes. So that was the evaluation activity. And the STEM sentences, Example of STEM sentences which we provided are seen on the next slide. In my opinion, I think I like the Bamileke cultural dance because, you know, we gave these stems and they were to use the STEM sentences to complete those STEM sentences so as to express their opinion about the cultural dances to their group mates. So, excuse me. So the lesson was very practical, promoting oral fluency through critical thinking activities.
From there, that we could see in the learners, with describing visuals, this permitted the learners to link images to real life context. With the activity of Why Because game, learners reflected on their utterances and produced beautiful sentences. Like a learner who said, I think the game is, the event is colorful because, and the witness game, it provoked learners to do some collaborative thinking, like working in a team. And we saw that problem solving, like deciding, is this the image that was described to me or not? And with the story, they had to question that cultural value. Is it true that our grandfather lives in this spot or not? And with ranking, it was all about justifying opinion. So it's no more just taking it in, absorbing everything you're told. It's not like they're empty. Finally saw that these learners, they come with a lot in them that they could share and do much more. Well, thank you for your kind attention. You'll find below the story of our little girl from the West region. Hope you've learned something and you're going to practice this in the classroom. Thank you.